Thank you, Mary Dee. I appreciate your warm welcome. I see a lot of familiar faces in the group, and so it's particularly good to be here and make connections and reconnections. The real reason I'm here is that every Sunday morning for a long time, my wife has left home, and I decided I would follow her this time. So now I know where she goes. The first 10 or 12 years that I began my work in higher education, I spent all or half of my time teaching courses on Christian thought and social ethics. I also did some work on world religions during that period. Then my life took a different course since I was drawn into college administration and served at Salem as president, and then at Center College as president, which, by the way, is a Presbyterian institution, and then came to Richmond in 1988. And during that time, I was not teaching. I occasionally did some writing about some of these broad topics, and when I retired from my position as president at Richmond, I did teach for the next 5 or 6 years, and I had one course in particular that I taught a number of times, which at the time was called the Core Course. And in that course, which was required of all entering students, we had a kind of miniature great books program. And I taught in that with some degree of commitment, because a lot of the things that we were teaching I had some familiarity with, and it was a challenging teaching assignment because it was all based on discussion. But we read, talk about modern secular world, we read Darwin, Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche in that course. At the same time, we began the course reading reading Genesis. We began the second semester reading Matthew, after which students read Nietzsche. If you have any sense of Nietzsche's work up against Matthew, you know the kinds of contradictions that represents. Since my, whatever it is now, second or third or fourth retirement, I have begun to read again a lot of things that I read earlier, in part triggered by requests that people make to submit a publication. And it turns out a couple of years ago I was asked to do some writing on Charles Taylor, whom I had read earlier, but whose new book at the time, A Secular Age, you have to have two hands to carry this book. It tips in about 900 pages, counting the notes. But I was intrigued by Charles Taylor's thought, and so about, I guess, 6 or 8 months ago, I completed the draft of a chapter that's going to go in a publication connected to the Jepson School. And part of what you've read I have pulled out of that chapter that's coming out soon. That's one of the reasons that it says in various places, please don't quote this, because the publisher would be very unhappy if, even before they publish it, it somehow were seen as in the public domain. It's not exactly the same text, but there are sections that are fairly familiar. In any event, what I'm trying to find here is really a way to think about modern Christian thought, but it's more qualified than that. It's really modern Protestant thought, and it's really more qualified than that. It's really essentially Reformed thought. It happens that all the thinkers, with the exception of Taylor, who is, I believe, a liberal Catholic, and the exception maybe of Kierkegaard, who was a member of the State Church of Denmark as a Lutheran. All the other people we're reading have been very active Reformed theologians. And my preoccupation with modern is simply this: how do we find those thinkers and observe their methods and their conclusions who have a double concern? One concern is with the modern secular world and taking it very seriously, being really challenged by scientific thinking, the historical study of scriptures, historical relativism, and all of the things that go along with the secular world. And at the same time that they are deeply immersed in the secular world in terms of its thought forms and its, if you will, cultural foundations, they are also committed to the Christian tradition, Christian belief, the witness of the Bible, and they are trying very hard to combine those two different emphases and create their interpretation of how, in fact, they can become compatible. And they question both the modern side and they question, in effect, the Christian side in terms of trying to find those claims that don't result in some contradiction with what we know about modern scientific thinking and discovery. Now, it happens that you would then, because of that particular emphasis I'm giving here, you won't find some of the great thinkers and theologians of the last 75 years on my list. Karl Barth would be an obvious name that's not here. And that's because, in many ways, Barth is not really a modern theologian in the way I've defined it. He is a modern theologian in other ways, but he doesn't spend a lot of time trying to worry about the assumptions of scientific thinking and how that might relate to the biblical worldview. Earlier in his career, he might well have done that. Up until 1917, he did have much more of a liberal orientation. In fact, he had studied a lot of Schleiermacher, whom he then comes to see as, in effect, one of his major, if you will, antagonists as he develops his theology. So, although when I was at Yale's Divinity School and after, I read a lot of Barth, but I don't think he quite fits just in the way I've decided to set this up. So what we have, I think, in the readings that you have done and will be looking at are a lot of terms that are used in very different and sometimes confusing ways. Schleiermacher represents, in many ways, the beginning of modern theology, modern Protestant theology, with the preoccupations that I have suggested. And we'll talk about him, and you will be reading him for next week. And this German theologian has typically been called, in some ways, the formative force in liberal theology. That then evolves after Schleiermacher from the early 1800s to the early 1900s. And it has a very particular kind of meaning. And just to clarify it, when we think about saying, well, in Richmond there are a variety of churches, some are more conservative, some are more liberal, that's a kind of broad generic meaning, and it doesn't necessarily correspond to this specific meaning that I'm using here. Liberal theologians, starting with Schleiermacher, tried in effect to very much combine Christianity with modern thought. But they also evolved a set of particular emphases that came to characterize a movement. And it was, in effect, a heavy focus on what we might call natural religion, the religion that as a human being you have access to without necessarily relying upon the real revealed forms of truth that come through the church and through Scripture. It had a belief that although the church experience was vital and central, and we'll see that in Schleiermacher, there was also a kind of generalized religion that any human being anywhere had an ability to understand and to experience. That turned into a broad understanding that human beings could, in fact, on their own, church would help, flourish in the growth of human achievement and fulfillment. And there was signs everywhere of great progress. That by the end of the 19th century, it seemed that there was a growth in reform movements for democracy, that humans were discovering great insights in science and in other fields. And there was a belief that, in effect, the human being was a kind of touchstone for understanding the divine. After World War I, and after certainly World War II, liberal theology largely died in that form. There are certain emphases that continue, and we'll see that even in thinkers like Karl Barth and like his brother Richard Niebuhr. But they have typically been classified as neo-Orthodox. And the leading name in neo-Orthodoxy would be Karl Barth, with the heavy emphasis upon revelation as the only way in which we come to understand God. The people of Israel, who come to experience God's presence in their covenant with the Lord. And that's a revealed truth. Obviously, what happens in the total experience of Jesus Christ and the experience of the early church, and Paul is a perfect example, the heavy emphasis on the fact that God comes to meet you and that your groping, if you will, as a human being is entirely, can be entirely, usually is misleading, and can create all these little deities that are so common in the experience of the people of Israel, for example, or of the early Christians. There's always some deity from the past who's trying to shape the experience of the early church, or certainly of the people of Israel. And so neo-Orthodoxy says, we want to start with God, with the revealed truths through the church and in the Bible. And that's how theology is done. I say that's not a uniform perspective because there are lots of exceptions we'll see in some of the thinkers, but that's a marker. By the mid-1960s, I was teaching at the time, the death of God theology came, and to me it's not a particularly important movement, except to say, people began at this point to say, wait a minute, neo-Orthodoxy is also pretty modern because it's not necessarily a literalist interpretation of scriptures, because there had been a transformation, in part through liberal theology, to say we believe in the mighty acts of God all through the Old and the New Testaments, but often we understand those much more now in an interpretive form, in some kind of a symbolic interpretation. And so the death of God theologian says, well, what's God without mighty acts of God? And so, and there's all this fumbling around about how we can continue to believe in the ascension of Jesus, but no one really knows what they're talking about, so this is all over. And that then leads to, in many ways, through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, I think a very strong renewed evangelical conservative movement. When I was in graduate school and college, there was not a strong presence. Now, I, as a child, been to a lot of Billy Graham rallies, so I knew a lot about this tradition. And at the same time, it was not a marker on the theological map in the 40s and 50s. By the 60s, 70s, 80s, and since, it's become much more assertive, much more organized. It's got a wide spectrum of belief, but at the same time, it's highly influential now in a way that it wasn't more previously. Then we get now into the fact that there really is a wide spectrum today, I think, of different theological positions. Unlike the time in the 40s and 50s and 60s when Reinhold Niebuhr and Richard Niebuhr, and to some extent certainly Karl Barth, were sort of defining what you would read and study when you went off to theological school. Now if you go to theological school, you're going to probably hear about liberation theology, which is a movement that was at the heights in the 70s, but very much oriented to, particularly in South America, to social justice, often with a very activist tilt. Pope Francis, I think, would be very much in the tradition of this kind of thinking, and his critique of capitalism has strong connections with that position. The black church, of course, has become very self-conscious in terms of both its own message and understanding, as well as its ability to articulate the oppression from the wider culture. A lot of well-known names there, like Cornel West or James Cone. West has gone to Union Theological Seminary in New York now from Princeton. Feminist theology has had a major influence and is, I looked over the teaching roster of several of the institutions where I used to go, and there's always a position or two on the list of feminist theology, African American, black theology. There's also a kind of an openness to the broad canon of spirituality, and you find notions of connection with world religions, certainly a common theme. and then what is an interesting position called post-liberalism, which has now been associated with the work of George Lindbeck at Yale, Hans Frey at Yale, and a variety of other contemporary thinkers with influence like Stanley Hauerwas, who's a professor, a retired professor at Duke. And here the idea, in effect, is to, I think, probably draw on many of the themes of neo-orthodoxy, but with a much more, if you will, articulate sense of the relationship to the world. There is not a dismissal of the ways in which the world's positions and philosophies may influence the development of Christian thought, but it's looked at in terms of how the church itself and the scriptures themselves may have appropriated some of those themes. And what's important is the church's appropriation and the scripture's appropriation, not the philosophy or external form of thought itself. And much is driven by this notion of narrative. And we'll see that actually a lot in the work of H. Richard Niebuhr, who is, I think, probably, I'm biased, I wrote a dissertation on Richard Niebuhr, is probably one of the most influential thinkers sort of behind the scenes. His brother Reinhold was on the cover of Time. Richard Niebuhr was the theologian's theologian and had a profound influence on a lot of individuals studying theology. He taught George Lindbeck, who is a historian of doctrine at Yale. He had an office practically next to Hans Frey, who was another big influence here. He had passed away by the time Hauerwas got to Yale, but nonetheless, I think some of the lines are pretty clear in terms of what we might call post-liberalism. But the point in here is that there is nothing that is at all, I say, coherent about the contemporary world of theology. It's scattered all over the place. It doesn't have a central center of gravity the way we might have had with the turn from liberalism to neo-orthodoxy. So there are many different perspectives that are in the current world of theological thinking. Now, what I have found to be particularly interesting, as I say, is to see the way in which modern thinkers like Charles Taylor came to try to make sense of both the secular world and the world of religious experience. I happened on his work, I don't know, I guess probably 20-some years ago, when I read a book called Sources of the Self, The Making of the Modern Identity. And since I'd done a lot of work on the nature of the self in my own writing and research, I was really intrigued by the book and found it very rewarding. It's also very difficult to read. But then when this came out 7 or 8 years ago, I was spending a lot of time in New York in those days running a foundation called the Teagle Foundation. And we gave a grant to an organization that was trying to figure out these questions of the secular world and religious thought. And they started using a lot of Taylor's work. And that's how I then became engaged with this book. And it's a magnum opus. It does have a lot of trails that lead away from the main point, and then you're suddenly saying, well, how did we get here? But it's interesting, and it's well done, and the man is super erudite. And so what it reflects is someone who's grappling with a lot of what other modern religious thinkers have been grappling with. He is doing so as a philosopher. He is not a theologian. He is doing so as a historian of ideas. That's probably where I would see my work, is often as a historian of ideas. And in the process of doing that, he is trying to lay bare if you will, the elements of modern philosophical and social experience over against the notions of transcendence. Because transcendence in modern reflection has disappeared as any kind of a reference point in the normal ways in which a biologist or sociologist or even certainly philosophers tend to think about the world. It's not there. Now that, of course, relates to a lot of the themes in the modern theologians that we'll be looking at, because as you will read in the little handout for next week in Schleiermacher, Schleiermacher is a very modern thinker. You will see that he tries to root religious experience in a feeling of absolute dependence. And he's typical of what the thinkers that you will be reading are trying to do. They basically are saying, we have to do a new archaeology of human consciousness. We have to get to the formative places where religion actually grasps us, where it takes hold, where it's intelligible, and where it doesn't contradict the theories that are prevalent in natural science about how things happen, and the explanatory analyses that come from all kinds of modern investigations of the human experience. So how do we find those places in human experience that don't take us into contradiction with modern forms of thought? And in that archaeology, so to speak, deep investigation, uncovering the foundations, seeing what's there, there is an emphasis in Schleiermacher on feeling, understood as a form of immediate self-consciousness, as of self-awareness. So it's a very special definition of feeling. And then others, like Søren Kierkegaard, who's one generation later than Schleiermacher, who, by the way, is entirely orthodox in his forms of belief. He's not questioning, really, the creeds. But he's saying, we have to understand them and their meaning in a new way. You can't think you believe the creed if you articulate it in Sunday morning at church and then go about your business. If it flits across the top of your brain as an affirmative assent to a doctrine, that's not faith. So he is actually doing something also archaeological and saying, where does religion root? He says it roots in the existing individual, in the sense of, again, a kind of awareness of self as highly vulnerable in the world, with all of one's meanings being fragile, and with how faith then becomes a form of life. An answer to the question, what really counts? What really matters? And it's the way in which you shape the meaning of your existing, where religious truth is found. As you move over a bit then to Richard Niebuhr, you would find the appropriation both of Schleiermacher and of neo-orthodox emphasis from Barth, as well as a very heavy emphasis upon the existing individual, as you will see. It's probably a very effective synthesis of a lot of the themes that have surfaced, because there's in Niebuhr a very clear consciousness on what does it mean to be a responsible self in time, in eternity, in your place, and in the universal kingdom of God. How do you come to yourself as an authentic self in those contexts? Reinhold Niebuhr takes a different approach, but very consistent in many ways, and his major phenomenal rediscovery is of sin. And he comes along at the end of the liberal era as a pastor in New York, and he says, the liberal ideal of progressive human improvement is an illusion, and there is much more self-interest and pride and hypocrisy in the world than we are reckoning with. And he, as he sees the industrial movement move forward, and as he sees workers, he thinks, being taken advantage of, and he sees corporate response often to be, if you will, somewhat illusory, appearing to be sensitive to the plight of workers in a modern factory, and all the depersonalization and all the lack of safety controls and all the damage that is being done to human beings in this new mechanical environment. He says the current social gospel, a liberal belief that the teachings of Jesus can apply directly to the workplace, seems utterly naive. And so with the insight about the fallibility of human beings, about their self-interest, he applies those thoughts across a lot of social circumstances. And you'll see in the reading that you will do an analysis of his, it's called a dialectic because both ends of the proposition need each other to hold together, the dialectic of love and justice, which has had a huge impact on Christian social ethics. And I know the church has been involved in thinking hard about how to be impactful in the city up against questions, indeed, of justice. And Niebuhr is, I think, a continuing resource to think through the role of the church in terms of its social responsibilities. And all during the 40s, 50s, 60s, he was actually turned to by the leaders of the American government to better understand a totalitarian system like Soviet communism, and was in continuous conversation with people like John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, about how the hegemony of a system like that operates in terms of the underlying dimensions of human experience, and in that case, sin. So those are some of the things we're going to be looking at, and to start with Taylor, what we have is a theologian, not a theologian, a philosopher, who has really given deep thought to what the secular age is all about. And he quickly differentiates the components of secularism and suggests it's complex, but he pulls out three threads, and on one thread he's going to focus most of his attention. But secularism certainly means, for him, that the world that we know it, again, this is the North Atlantic world. Do not think of Middle East, because that contradicts a lot of what he says. He's thinking of Europe and the United States, Canada, the modern, if you will, democratic societies. He says, what's happened, of course, is there's been disestablishment. There is a drastic separation of church and state in all of these societies, and it's intensely foundational for those societies. He does know and acknowledges that there are certain parts of the United States that where that sense does not pervade as much in others. If you go to the two coasts, you're often living in a very different world than if you come into the inner heartland of the United States, where there often is a much greater emphasis on even public policy being influenced heavily by religious belief. And we're seeing all those battles being fought right before our eyes every day. But nonetheless, there still is a strong sense of disestablishment in this country and others. The second theme is really secularism refers also to the fact that the intensity of religious practice has declined. Now, again, that's a mixed statement, because there are some forms of Christianity that are growing while others seem, in numbers at least, to be dropping. And it is often some of the more conservative churches, some of the churches that have a strong and powerful emotional connection, like Pentecostalism, that are growing in the United States and across the globe. And so it's not an easy and simple distinction. At the same time, religious practice in many contexts, if you look at the numbers of adherents in the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, you see the numbers have dropped substantially. But along with that, there is also a vast amount of religious pluralism. And you see this on a college campus now. When I walk across the campus at the University of Richmond, it's a very different place than the one I arrived at some 27 years ago. We had an affiliation with the Baptist General Association of Virginia at the time. And of course, they were going through their own internal debates and in fact, separation finally into two different denominations. But we still had a lot of the symbolism of a Baptist institution. And a lot of the students still, probably 15% or so, came from Baptist churches in Virginia. Now, as you walk across the campus, there are students from all across the world. There are a lot of students from mainland China. I think 140 students are from mainland China, a lot of students from Korea. And it's a very diverse population. And the campus ministry is also very diverse now. So you have ministry for all these different backgrounds of students in their religious training. So pluralism, though, obviously does set a very different tone. It means that much of religion publicly is privatized. I noticed when I was teaching, it's very hard to get students to talk about religion. I tried to think of all kinds of ways to do it, and students don't want to do it because it's private. And therefore it happens maybe in a small group, but not in the classroom. So it's a very difficult and kind of tender set of emphases. Religion is then largely privatized. And in most parts of the country, you can believe pretty much anything outside of a standard denomination. It's not going to impede your progress toward a position of leadership. So we have in the last presidential race, we had a Mormon who presented, obviously, Mitt Romney. And now we have Dr. Carson, who comes from, again, a Seventh-day Adventist background, which, again, is not within the mainstream of the denominations as we've known them in the past. So privatization, pluralism, lower degrees of engagement, and the acceptability of that in most frames of reference. But the third, and for him the most important sense of this world that has appeared, is what he calls that the changing conditions of belief and experience. And he illustrates this in a lot of different ways and I'll only cover several points. But among the changing conditions of belief and experience in which we all share, and whether we are religious or not, whether we're orthodox or not, these cultural forms are inescapable. So, for example, he often uses words in slightly different ways, so you have to back up and say, what does he mean by that? When we think we're buffered from something, it means we're protected from it. And he has this term called the buffered self. And he puts into tension the buffered self versus the porous self. The buffered self is our world. And that means that we are protected from, stand back from, and we see ourselves buffered from a lot of the forces of nature in which our forebears were deeply immersed. We can protect ourselves through medicine and through stability of our lives, a kind of predictability in which we control a lot of the forces of nature that used to absolutely every day be a challenge for our forebears. And being enmeshed in that, if you will, everyday world, our ancestors perceived the world as filled with good and evil spirits, such as demons and angels, supernatural powers that threatened them with an enchanted world. And they practiced rituals, made pilgrimages, offered up prayers, engaged in mortification, seeking security and trying to find health and protection. One gained access to that supernatural world by acts of faith. In the tradition of the Catholic Church, you made an act of faith to the authority of the Church, and then with that came insight into a kind of supernatural knowledge about what was really happening in the world. That came then in the everyday life with continuing awareness of the way that supernatural world impinged upon everyday events, with particular consciousness then of spirits and demons. Some years ago, I did a little study and reading about Chartres Cathedral. And in the process of doing that, I read a little book that said what was really powerful about Notre-Dame de Chartres, Our Lady of Chartres, named for the Virgin, was that it had La Chemise de Marie. It had Mary's tunic, her blouse. This was the belief. Where they got it, it usually came from the Middle East, and someone made a very good deal to sell that to a pope or a bishop. They paid a fortune to get the thorns, the crown of thorns of Christ around which they built the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. It was actually not the crown of thorns. But so what happened with La Chemise de Marie in the Chartres Cathedral was that in 12-something, again, some of my ancestors from one line were Vikings. And the Vikings appeared at this holy place that kept the Chemise de Marie, a pilgrimage center. But the Vikings were about to take control, and they had sacked the town, and they were ready to take the church. And the bishop went forward with the Chemise de Marie, presented that to the warring Vikings, and they got out of there fast. They didn't want to come to terms with the spiritual power of the Chemise de Marie. Legend? Yeah, probably. 100 years later, there was a terrible fire in Chartres and destroyed much of the church. And then at the end, as they were looking in the crypt, everything had been burned except there was the Chemise de Marie that was unharmed. So the sense of belief in demons and spirits and miracles of various kinds was very common in everyday life. And I was reading Mark last night and thinking about this, and I came upon the passage about the demons that greeted Jesus in the man who lived in the tombs, and he sent the demons off into the pigs. And I was thinking, well, there's a good example of an early belief in the power of demons. And that carries through. So a condition of our life is that we have a sense of being buffered from a lot of those kinds of forces and factors. That comes with the terrain. You can't turn on your internet and probably easily believe that Mary's shirt was saving the Vikings, was saving the church. But there are a lot of other factors, and we could go into many of them, but I picked several. One of them is that we live, and this is a really interesting thought, we live in an age of authenticity. And this is much in the Sources of the South makes this point, as does his book on the secular age. We live in an age of authenticity in the sense that we are so different than our forebears who were born into a social class or caste, into a place in society that defined your identity. So if you were born as a serf, born as a blacksmith, born as anyone practicing a certain kind of way of life or trade, you stayed there. You did not agonize substantially over your place in life, what you were going to become, how you were going to make your fortune, what influence you were going to have, or whether you were going to run for President of the United States. You had a place, and it was fixed. And it was related then often to seasonal rituals, celebrations at different times of the year. There was a rhythm to the fixed station of your existence. We move now to an age of authenticity. And it's now up to us to find our true selves and to live out our passion and to be the best person we can be. And we naturally, without thinking about it, foster those kinds of ideas in our children and our grandchildren, and it's the most natural thing in the world. What are you going to find that's really going to be interesting to you? Don't do it because someone else wants you to do it. Do it because you own it, because that's who you are. So the age of authenticity is something that also very much characterizes who we are. Now, what's really interesting for Taylor is that some of these threads show something different than some other interpreters of the secular age would emphasize. What he emphasizes is that the secular age is not simply the subtraction of these exalted former beliefs. It's not simply that we have said, well, Darwin helps us understand the natural processes of evolution, so we'll put aside, for a moment at least, God's role in some of those specific passages that we read in Genesis. I mean, it's true, but it's not true as a scientific account. So we say, okay, we put that aside, and then we see God's really not involved in some of these miraculous events that people thought were happening to them in the Middle Ages and after. That's a subtraction from what was believed in the past. But he then goes on to say, but the secular age is not just subtraction. What's happened peculiarly in the secular age is that we have replaced a lot of those former ideas with what he calls an exclusive humanism. That is to say, it's not that we have just given up a lot of older beliefs. We've taken on some new ones. And one of them is we've made a central place in our belief systems for a secular, exclusive humanism without God, without a foundation. And society at large functions according to those kinds of tacit beliefs and values. And it shows up in all kinds of different forms. So we'll come back to that in a minute, but that's an important way in which he has tried to show that there is a shared common morality that in the secular world has no foundation. That's a critique, actually. But some of the other features of the secular world are, I think, very obvious in terms of some of the points we made earlier about some of the modern Christian thinkers. One point that's interesting that Taylor makes is that much of the organizational lives we lead are, again, brutally secular. If you've ever worked in a modern corporation, and I expect many of you have, you know the ways in which the life of a bureaucratic organization takes on a life of its own. It's a kind of closed system in which the corporation's success in reaching its numbers becomes a very competitive process in which people sacrifice a great deal to make sure the numbers get where they are, and that we can beat the competition, and that we can reach the goals that we've set for ourselves. And then sometimes it tears people up, and people are brought in and they leave, often because they didn't make their numbers. And so there's a certain kind of what he calls iron cage experience about life in a modern corporation or a modern organization. You could say the same thing about life quite frankly, in a university. You don't get your publications done and get some grant funding. We love you, but you're out of here because you're not going to get a permanent position. And we won't say anything negative about you, but you're not going to make it. It's brutally competitive in many contexts. But beyond that, the thought world is an area that Taylor focuses on as one of his central points for understanding secularism. And that thought world is characterized, again, using the word a little differently, by the term immanence. That is to say, the worlds that we live in are characterized by thought forms that are based on causal connections, causal relationships. And we try to find those causal relationships through quantitative analysis of what's happening. And we give our evidence in those terms. And that's how we think. If someone wants to make a claim about a drug that cures a certain disease, you better have the studies and the blind studies and the numbers and the statistics that show that that's actually what has happened. And so every way in which we think about modern academic disciplines functions in that way. There are models and there are quantitative explanations, and there is no easy appeal to say, well, that's the way I felt about it. There is objectivity that drives the whole process of immanence and thinking about all things, whether they are purportedly religious or not. Now that has a lot